There is a kind of power that doesn't announce itself, doesn't show off, and, above all, doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't shout. It doesn't impose itself through brute force. It doesn't need applause. And precisely because of that, it dominates. While most people struggle desperately to be seen, heard, and recognized, there is a minority that has learned something far more dangerous: to control without appearing to control, to influence without revealing intention, to win before the conflict even begins. And what if I told you that the greatest strategists in history weren't the loudest, but the most silent? Men like Sun Tzu and Nicolau Machiavelli understood something that most people still ignore today. True power does not lie in visible action, but in the invisible mind behind it. But here's the point almost no one realizes. This kind of power demands a psychological price that very few are willing to pay. And this is exactly where most people fail. Because before you can dominate the external world, you have to face something far more uncomfortable: your own internal world. And that isn't pretty, it isn't romantic, and it definitely isn't for everyone. Most people live believing that control comes from strength, authority, or social status. They want to lead, to be respected, to have influence. But without realizing it, they make the most basic mistake of all. They become predictable. And predictability is weakness. Sun Tzu wrote over 2,000 years ago that all warfare is based on deception. But that line isn't about physical battle. It's about the mind, about perception, about how people interpret you, and, more importantly, how you shape that interpretation without them noticing. Now, think for a second. How many times have you been manipulated without realizing it? How many times have you made decisions believing they were yours, when, in reality, they were carefully influenced by someone who understood the human mind better than you? This happens every day, on social media, in relationships, at work, in politics. There is a game happening all the time, and those who don't understand the game inevitably become a piece in it. But here's a crucial detail. Silent leaders don't play the same game as everyone else. They operate on another level. While most react, they anticipate. While most speak, they observe. While most seek attention, they accumulate power. And that brings us to an uncomfortable question. Why is silence so powerful? The answer begins in a place few people like to visit: the ego. Friedrich Nietzsche argued that the greatest human problem is not weakness, but the constant need for validation. People want to prove something. They want to show they are intelligent, strong, superior, relevant. And in this desperate need to be recognized, they reveal everything: their intentions, their fears, their insecurities. And without realizing it, they show their hand. Now imagine someone who doesn't do that. Someone who observes more than they speak, who listens more than they react, who understands the emotional game without being dragged into it. that person becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability creates something very specific in the human mind: discomfort. The human brain is wired to look for patterns. When someone breaks those patterns, the system goes into alert mode. And it is exactly in that moment that power begins to emerge. Because whoever controls other people's discomfort controls their decisions. But here's the trap. Most people can't sustain this kind of behavior because it requires something that goes against basic human instinct: extreme self-control. And this is where Carl Jung enters the conversation. Jung spoke about the shadow, the part of the mind that contains everything we repress, deny, or pretend doesn't exist. Impulses, desires, envy, anger, ambition. Most people try to hide this shadow. Silent leaders do the opposite. They study it, they understand it, and more importantly, they integrate it. Because they know that ignoring your nature doesn't eliminate the problem. It only makes it invisible. And what is invisible is harder to control. Now, think about this. How many decisions do you make based on emotion, but justify as logic? How many times do you react without realizing you were provoked? How often do you speak more than you should, just to relieve internal discomfort? Those are exactly the moments where you lose power, and someone more aware gains it. Nicolau Machiavelli understood this better than most. He didn't see the world as it should be, but as it actually is. And that difference changes everything. Because when you abandon the illusion that people act fairly, rationally, or morally, you begin to see real behavioral patterns: self-interest, fear, the desire for control, the pursuit of advantage. And suddenly, everything becomes more predictable. But here's the paradox. To become unpredictable to others, you must deeply understand what is predictable in them. And that requires something most people avoid: observation without judgment, without moralizing, without romanticizing, without deceiving yourself. Most people want to believe others are good, or they want to believe they are bad. But silent leaders know that's simplistic. People are strategic. They adapt to context. They act in ways that maximize their interests. And they change when necessary. And that isn't cynicism. It's clarity. Now, this is where things become truly uncomfortable. Because understanding this in others is easy. The hard part is recognizing it in yourself. You manipulate too. You seek advantage too. You react emotionally, even when you think you're being rational. And until you accept that, you remain predictable. Because what you deny within yourself controls you. Socrates said, "Know thyself." But few people understand the real weight of that phrase. Knowing yourself isn't about discovering your favorite color or your dreams. It's about facing your contradictions, your weaknesses, your most uncomfortable impulses, and still maintaining control. And this is exactly where the mental strategy of silent leaders begins to take shape. They don't try to be perfect. They try to be aware. And Awareness creates choice. Choice creates control. And control creates power. But this power isn't visible. It doesn't show up as status, followers, or immediate recognition. In fact, it often goes unnoticed, and that is intentional. Because the less you are perceived as a threat, the more freedom you have to act. Now think about social media. Those who talk the most, expose themselves the most, constantly position themselves, are constantly revealing their minds, their beliefs, their emotional triggers, their reaction patterns, and that creates a map that any more strategic person can use. Silent leaders observe, learn, collect information, and only act when the outcome is already almost decided. But an inevitable question arises. Isn't this manipulation? Yes, but not in the simplistic way most people think. Manipulation isn't just deception. It's the shaping of perception. And perception defines reality. If you believe someone is trustworthy, you behave differently around them. If you believe someone is weak, you test their limits. If you believe someone is dangerous, you pull back. Now imagine someone who understands this deeply, someone who knows exactly what perception to create in each context. That person doesn't need to force anything. The people around them do the work for them. And this is where the game completely changes, because it's no longer about acting, but about shaping the environment. And when you shape the environment, other people's decisions begin to feel natural, even when they were influenced. But there is a huge risk here. And it's the risk that destroys most people who try to apply this kind of strategy, losing their own identity. Because when you begin to understand human behavior too well, you realize something unsettling. Almost everything can be influenced, and that can lead to a dangerous state where nothing feels authentic, where everything feels like a game, where every relationship feels strategic. And this is exactly where many people get lost, because they confuse awareness with coldness. They confuse strategy with constant manipulation. They confuse power with total control, and they end up becoming what they once despised. But true silent leaders don't fall into that trap. They understand something very few people realize. The greatest power is not controlling others. It is not being controlled. And that brings us to the most critical point of all: emotional control. Because in the end, everything comes back to this. You can understand strategy. You can study human behavior. You can learn patterns. But if you don't control your own reactions, everything collapses. A comment irritates you. A criticism destabilizes you. A provocation makes you act impulsively. And in that instant, all your power disappears, because you've been pulled into someone else's emotional game. And whoever defines the game wins. Now, here's something few people admit. Most people live reacting. They don't choose. They respond. And every automatic response is a loss of autonomy. But silent leaders pause, observe, and in that small space between stimulus and response, they build advantage. And it is exactly at this point that something even deeper begins to happen. Something not written in strategy books. Something neither Sun Tzu nor Machiavelli explained directly. But that sustains everything they taught. There is a level of mastery where you don't just control your actions, you begin to influence the very perception of reality around you. And when that happens, people don't just react to you. They start adjusting without knowing why. But this requires such a deep internal shift that most people never even get close. Because it involves letting go of something people defend with everything they have, the need to be right. And this is where things start to become truly dangerous. Before we continue, if this kind of content is already shifting the way you see the world, then do something simple right now. Subscribe to the channel Art of Awareness, leave a like, and comment below what impacted you the most so far. Because the more you engage, the more this kind of knowledge reaches you. Now, let's go back exactly to where we left off. Letting go of the need to be right. It sounds simple, almost trivial. But in practice, it's one of the hardest things there is. Because being right isn't just logical. It's emotional, it's identity, it's ego. When someone disagrees with you, it's not just an idea being questioned, it's you. And that's why people react. They defend, they attack, they try to prove, they try to win. But here's the point that changes everything. While you're trying to be right, someone more strategic is trying to understand. And understanding always wins. Nicolau Machiavelli knew this. For him, it didn't matter whether something was morally beautiful or intellectually correct. What mattered was the effect, the result, the consequence. And this creates a deep rupture in the way most people think. Because we've been conditioned to believe that truth, by itself, has power. But in reality, what has power is the perception of truth. And that completely changes the game. Because now it's not about who is right, but about who better influences how others perceive what is right. And that requires a level of emotional detachment that borders on extreme discomfort, because it means accepting that many times you can be right and still lose, and someone can be wrong and still win. This happens every day, in politics, on social media, in debates, in relationships. Whoever controls the narrative controls the outcome. But here's a detail almost no one notices. Controlling the narrative begins inside your own mind. Because before influencing others, you must stop being a hostage to your own internal stories. And those stories are more powerful than they seem. Carl Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Now think about that carefully. How many beliefs do you carry without ever questioning them? How many interpretations do you make automatically without realizing it? How often do you assume intentions in others based on past experiences? All of this creates a filter, and that filter distorts reality. And when your perception is distorted, your decisions will be too. And here's the problem. You don't notice it because to you, it feels like truth. And that's exactly why most people are predictable. They don't react to what's actually happening. They react to what they believe is happening. And that difference is where the game is won or lost. Silent leaders understand this at an almost unsettling level. They don't fully trust even their own perception. They question, they observe patterns, they test reactions, and they adjust. While most assume, they investigate. While most judge, they analyze. And this creates an enormous advantage, because whoever understands how the mind interprets the world can influence that interpretation. And when you influence interpretation, you influence action. Now here's the most intense part of all this, because this is where strategy stops being theory and becomes real psychological practice. There is a mental state where you no longer react automatically. You're not emotionally attached to your own ideas, and you don't need to prove anything to anyone. A state where you observe, choose, and act with precision. This isn't coldness. This is mastery. And that mastery begins with something extremely simple, yet brutally difficult. Conscious pause. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. Epictetus spoke about this indirectly. It's not events that affect us, but our interpretation of them. Now, connect that with everything we've seen so far. If you control interpretation, you control reaction. And if you control reaction, you control outcome. But here's the trap almost everyone ignores. Self-control is not about suppressing emotions. It's about understanding them without being dominated by them. Because suppressed emotion doesn't disappear. It accumulates, and eventually it explodes. And when it explodes, you lose everything you built. Silent leaders are not cold people. They are conscious people. They feel, but they don't get dragged. They notice anger, but don't react from it. They notice fear, but don't decide from it. They notice ego, but don't follow it. And this creates something rare, consistency. While most people fluctuate, they remain stable. And stability in a chaotic world is power. Now, here comes a shift that completely changes how you see influence. Most people try to control situations directly. They speak louder, they impose, they argue, they confront. But that creates resistance. And resistance creates conflict. And conflict consumes energy. Silent leaders do the opposite. They don't confront directly. They reposition. They change the context. They change perception. They change the emotional environment. And when the environment changes, behavior changes naturally. Without confrontation, without visible effort. This is what Sun Tzu meant by winning without fighting. It's not about avoiding conflict out of weakness. It's about not needing it. Now think about something simple. One person walks into a room and starts speaking loudly, trying to impose respect. Another walks in, silently, observes, and speaks only when necessary. Which one seems more in control? The answer isn't in the volume, it's in the presence. And presence is not something you fake. It's something you build internally. It comes from the absence of need. The need for approval, the need for validation, the need to win arguments. The less you need, the more power you have. And this creates an almost invisible effect. People begin to perceive you differently. Without knowing why, they adjust. They measure their words. They observe more. Because they feel that there is something there. Something not obvious, but strong. And that brings us to the final point of this journey, the true meaning of silent leadership. It's not about manipulating everyone around you. It's not about controlling every situation. It's not about playing a psychological game all the time. It's something much deeper. It's becoming someone who cannot be easily influenced, someone who understands the game, but is not a prisoner of it. Someone who sees the layers of reality without getting lost in them, because in the end, the greatest risk of understanding all of this is forgetting to live authentically. And that's why few people get this far, because it requires balance between strategy and humanity, between awareness and action, between power and responsibility. And when that balance happens, something shifts permanently. You no longer need to prove anything. You no longer need to convince all the time. You no longer need to react to every stimulus. You simply choose. And that choice, silent, invisible, consistent, is what separates those who are controlled from those who truly control. Now, if you made it this far, then you already realize this is not common knowledge. And that's exactly why I want to ask you something simple. Subscribe to Art of Awareness, leave a like, and comment below which part expanded your way of thinking the most. Because this kind of content isn't just meant to be watched, it's meant to be absorbed, reflected on, and applied. And the deeper you go, the less you return to who you used to be.